What I want to do in this class, partly because it's a spiritual formation class, and just quickly to go through the syllabus. I've just got to tell you, remind you about all those rules about plagiarism and so on, and you know that you'll be hung, drawn, and quartered, or shot at dawn, or something if you disobey any of that. Is everybody happy with that? You know, okay. I mean, I pay absolutely no attention to any of it, but you know. The other thing that what I want to do, because this is a spiritual formation class, and because Anglican spiritual tradition is very much practice as well as theory. I mean, there is a theory behind it, but one of the characteristics of the tradition is its practice, you know, and it has been right from the beginning. What I want to do is actually worship together, or do the worship services together, as you know, not just sit and talk about it. All right. So what I thought we would do is have the first half of the class here as class, real class, and then after a break, have a break, a substantial break, have the second part as going through worship, all right, looking at the principles and so on, and then actually doing it, because then you see how it works, okay? This is why I wanted to get a copy of the prayer book and so on, so that we can actually live it and not just talk about it. All right? I mean, we will talk about it as well, because I want you to reflect on it. But it's very important, because you cannot understand Anglicanism without understanding its practice. The Anglican Church is different from other kinds of Protestant churches in that it's the only one which has prayer and preaching as part of its official constitution. You know, I mean, I'm not saying we're superior to others or anything like that. I'm not saying that. But it's just different. That other churches will have confessions of faith and books of order, rules of order, and this kind of thing. But Anglicanism you cannot really fully appreciate unless you appreciate that right from the very beginning, preaching and prayer have been fundamental to its identity, all right, in a particular way. And you may not like it. Lots of people have disliked it for various reasons, and we can talk about that and see why it is and it isn't. But unless you know about it, you will not. You have to understand it, okay? And so I felt this was the best way of doing it. Is that all right? And it's also, of course, late in the afternoon, and so you know, I mean, if you're going to fall asleep, you might as well look as if you're praying. We can do that. But you see what I'm saying? I want to do that because that way you experience it as something more than just thinking in the head. All right? Okay. Anybody got any questions at this point? Is there anything that I have said or not said that's not clear? No. Wow. Good. Okay. Let's pray together then, and we can begin. Let's pray. Our Father, thank you for this time we have together this afternoon. And Lord, I pray that as we work and as we study together, that you would bless us, that you would draw us very close to yourself, and that you would help us in all that we do to keep our Lord Jesus Christ before our eyes, that we might serve him, that we might glorify him in all that we do, and that in all things we might know that we are here to rejoice in the coming of your Son into the world, into the life and death which he lived, our union with him in his church, and that we might grow to be more like him during these days together. For Jesus' precious name's sake, we ask it. Amen. Right, okay, what is the Anglican spiritual tradition? How do we define this? It may seem obvious to some of you anyway, but actually this is something which has been very controversial for a very long time. And it's still controversial today because depending on who you ask, very different answers will be given. One of the things about Anglicanism is that it is internally divided to a degree which is not true of, say, Presbyterians or Lutherans or whatever. And partly, of course, this is because of the way in which it's constructed, that when you have a church which is based on prayer and preaching as well as on doctrine, I'm not saying there's no doctrine, but it's kind of more diverse in this way. Inevitably, spirituality, people's spiritual expression and experience will vary from one individual to another. So the more you allow for this, the more diversity you're going to have. But also, of course, because of the nature of the English Reformation. The Lutheran Reformation or the Calvinist Reformation was basically a grassroots movement, one kind or another, with lots of doctrine and teaching and so on. And that was, defined in that way. The English Reformation, by contrast, was imposed from the top. It was a movement from the top down, not from the bottom up. There was very little theology or doctrine in it originally. But, of course, what it lacks in theology, it makes up for in sex and violence, which, of course, makes it much more interesting. And this is why you get films about, people make movies about the English Reformation in a way that they don't about others, because there's lots of blood and gore, and pretty women and things like that, that you just don't find elsewhere. So there are compensations, shall we say. However, we mustn't be misled by that either, because there is a core of doctrine, a core of teaching which is there, and this is what we're concerned about mostly during this course, to see that what the fundamentals are, how they come together, and why they have developed in the way that they have. The way I want to approach this today is to go back to the 16th century, to the time when the Reformation began in England, and to look at the way people then perceived their church. Who did they think they were? What did they think about their faith and the way things were? And to what extent did they think change, reform was necessary or important, or what was going to happen? I mean, how was this going to work? What was the impact that it was going to have on people, and where did it go from there? And it's only when we do this, when we sort of put ourselves in this position, that we can begin to see why it developed in the way that it did, the sort of characteristics that it had, that it wouldn't otherwise have had. People have always had ideas about their own past. History, writing history has always been a form of self-definition. In other words, you cannot go back and live in the past. You just can't do that. And everything you say about the past is a selection of facts, a selection of ideas. It's a construction. You put it together and you interpret it in a particular way. And whatever anybody says about this, the way you construct the past is really derived from what you think about yourself in the present. You know, what you need to look back into the past in order to find. Now, in secular history, you see this nowadays, because in the modern world, you know, people are very concerned about women, children, ethnic minorities, disabled people, you know, all the people who've lost out historically. Okay, and they want to rectify this, and this is fine, you know, no problem about it, in one way. The only problem from the historical point of view is that people in the past didn't think like that. You know, I mean, people who lived even 50, 60 years ago, never mind 500 or 600 years ago, weren't interested in domestic life. It wasn't that they didn't have a domestic life, you know, but what people ate for breakfast didn't concern anybody in 1850. So they didn't write about it as if it mattered. So somebody, you know, at UAB in 2012 who's writing a thesis about, you know, breakfast in 1850, because this is going to determine what kind of people lived in 1850, they're basically taking a modern concern, a modern social concern, and slapping it on some past period where the evidence is slender, shall we say. You know, I'm not saying that there's nothing to it, but you kind of have to construct something that to the people who lived in that time would have seemed very odd. I mean, it's not that they didn't do these things, but they wouldn't have understood why anybody was interested in them. You know, what do you care what I eat for breakfast? You know. But you see what I'm saying, that the concerns of the present are sort of are projected onto the past, even when the evidence in the past is not necessarily there to support it. Now, this has always been the case, all right? And in the 16th century, people did this, taking their own concerns and slapping it on the past, reinterpreting the past to suit their particular concerns, whether these things actually happened or not. And of course, what has happened since that time is a process which is known technically as historical revisionism. This is what it's called. That each generation sort of goes back and deconstructs the myths of the past. You know, so somebody writing a history book today will sort of say, well, you know, people used to think that, you know, it was this, and this, but actually it wasn't like that at all. And I'm going to tell you what life was really like, you know, back in 1500. And of course, what they tell you is not necessarily any more true than what they're rejecting. It's just a different set of data that they're playing around with in a different way. All right? Now, the question of the relationship between perception and fact is a very, very complex one. It's an open question, really, as to which of these two is more important. If I can give you some examples from American history, you may understand this. American history is interesting because it's extremely well documented, as histories go, you know. I mean, there's massive documentation about the history of the United States. Not everything, but a lot of things. I mean, take a classic example, the settlement of the West. You can go to the Department of whatever it is, land or whatever, in Washington and dig out endless files about how you know, the West was divided up into homesteads and, you know, given to this person, that person, the other person. You can trace it all, who owned the land, who went where, and so on. It's all very clearly documented. How many people do this? Well, virtually nobody. Who is interested in this? Even fewer people. You know, why is this the case? Are people not interested in the settlement of the West? Oh, no, it's not that. It's just that everybody knows how the West was won. The West was won by a bunch of cowboys and crooks and criminals and so on, who have become national heroes because, they stood in the dirt streets of Carson City or whatever at high noon and fought duels against whatever, or they chased Sitting Bull or this kind of thing. And we all know this, don't we? Why do we know this? Because we've seen it on TV. The Wild West has basically been invented. But this is what people know, and this is what people tend to believe. Now, it is not to say that these people never existed. I mean, there was a person called Daniel Boone, and there was a person called Davy Crockett, and there was a person called Jesse James, and there was a person called Bill Clinton, and so on. It's just that what you think about them and what they really were are two different things. And you look back now and you say, well, demythologizing this is of no interest to anybody. Because to discover who the real Annie Oakley was is probably going to turn you off. You're going to say, well, oh, is that all? Is that what she really did? Oh, I prefer the myth. More interesting, you see. And this is the way it goes. Now, occasionally you get somebody who's totally invented. Not very often. But it does occasionally happen. I mean, Scarlett O'Hara is the obvious example of this. Someone who we know never existed. We know precisely who invented her and why and when. But all you have to do is have lunch in the cafe at Samford, and you meet Scarlett O'Hara every 2 seconds. They walk past you, And so you say to yourself, well, when does the myth and reality, where's the reality here? You see what I mean? And this has become sort of iconic, symbolic, even though it had, and this is what the Old South was like. Gone with the wind. This is what everybody thinks. And the boring person who takes you around these places and says it wasn't like that at all is welcome to go away, because we're not interested in them. You see what I mean? Now, I've taken these examples because they're well known, they're well documented, and they're fairly recent. All right? And there's really no question about it. But now project this back into a time in history which is not well known, which is not well documented, and where your opinion is maybe just as good as anybody else's. You see? Because, of course, this is what you get in the history of England. You see, American history is peopled by men and women who existed, but who've been mythologized. I mean, British history is peopled by figures who may never have existed, but who have been mythologized. Like Robin Hood and Sherlock Holmes and people like this. I mean, they never existed, but they're kind of more real than the people who did exist. All right? And in the 16th century, this is a problem that you have, because people had a picture of what had happened, a picture of the way their country and their church had developed, which bears little or no relation to reality. Because if you had gone back to ask the reformers, the English reformers, how did the church start in this country? Who were the first Christians in this country? Who was the first Christian to land in England? Do you know? According to them. Or to land in Britain, because there was no England then. If you'd gone to Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who led the English Reformation, and asked him, who was the first Christian person to land in this country? Well, what would he have said to you? Who was it? No, way before that. You know the person. You've heard of the person, but not in this connection. Because this person is in the New Testament. And it's not the Apostle Paul. No, nobody knows? Well, I'll give you a hint. It's the good guy at the crucifixion. If you read the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, well, apart from the thief who was crucified, who obviously it wasn't, wasn't him, but leaving him aside, there really is only one good guy in the whole story, and who is it? What? John? No, not really. John's kind of shadowy figure. He's there, but he's not really clear. And the disciples all ran away. It's not one of the disciples. What? The centurion, no, he's too vague. This person has a name. Joseph of Arimathea, yes, of course. Joseph of Arimathea is the first Christian to have landed in Britain, according to the myth, you see. Now, Joseph of Arimathea was a very convenient first person to have landed, because what's special about Joseph? Why would you pick Joseph of Arimathea, apart from the fact that he was a good guy at the crucifixion? What, sorry? That's always very useful. Yes, we don't know much about him. What we don't know, we can feel free to make up. Yeah, this is like Bill Clinton. All right. Okay, yes. So there's that aspect. Yes, we know he existed, but we know sufficiently little that there's room for expansion. Yes, this is true. Okay, that's one thing. But what do we know about him? Because that's also quite important. I mean, why is Joseph famous? What did he do? Yeah, he gave up his tomb. So Jesus was buried, and rose again in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. All right? So, I mean, you couldn't really get much closer to Jesus than this. You know, he died in my grave sort of thing, you know, or was buried in my tomb. So this is a very close connection here. All right? Now, add to this, you see, because remember, what is the Christian life all about? I mean, what's the connection? What happens to you when you become a Christian? Yes, but before you're born again, what do? You die with Christ. You're buried with Christ in baptism. Do you see why Joseph of Arimathea is so important? Because you're buried with Christ in baptism, which means that you too are buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. You see, there's a link here, and this is felt. You see, people think that Joseph of Arimathea is a good ancestor to have in this respect, because he's typical. He represents something. All right. So, of course, once you have this, I mean, this is based on New Testament evidence, shall we say. Joseph of Arimathea, after it's all over, what happened to him? Well, we don't know, but the legend was that he went to Britain. And he took with him, of course, a piece of the true cross, the cross of Christ, which is possible, because after all, he was there at the time. He could have done that. And he took a couple of thorns from the crown of thorns, which again is not impossible, because he was there. All right? And when he landed in Britain, he went to a place called Glastonbury, which is still there today, and planted the thorns. And a thorn tree grew up, the Glastonbury thorn, which, of course, is the thorn tree which grew out of the crown of thorns that Jesus wore on the cross. Okay? Now, what is the significance of this? The death of the crucifixion of Jesus and the crown of thorns. You see, the crucifixion is the coronation of Jesus. this is where he is proclaimed king. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The crown of thorns is his crown. All right? And so, of course, you have here the archetypal model of Christian kingship. And what Joseph of Arimathea brings to Britain is this. You see? And it's very important to understand this, because all through the history, the connection between the kingship and the cross of Christ, the crown of Christ, is very close. You see, in English history, this is something. The link between church and state is not just a legal thing. There is a spiritual connection here. And you have to appreciate this. You have to understand. I mean, okay, it's been mythologized, that's true. But you have to see how this was perceived. All right? And, of course, it has an authority. This is the other thing. It has an authority which trumps the authority of the Pope. Because who, after all, is the Pope? The Pope is the successor of Peter, all right, in Rome. But Peter set a very bad example at the time of the crucifixion. He denied Jesus and ran away. Peter was one of the bad guys in his own funny way. Certainly quite unlike Joseph of Arimathea wasn't afraid to be identified with Jesus. He took the body and buried the body in his own tomb. He stuck his neck out, if you like, for Jesus, which Peter didn't do. Therefore, of course, Joseph of Arimathea is a better person than Peter. And so the successors of Joseph of Arimathea are better off than the successors of Peter. You see how this logic works, all right? And we don't have to kowtow to the Bishop of Rome as the successor of Peter, because we've got Joseph of Arimathea on our side, and he goes right back to the crucifixion, all right? So all of this plays into the story, okay? The other thing, of course, that people knew, and this is historical fact, everything I've told you about Joseph of Arimathea, apart from the bit that you already knew, is basically false. All right? It's a good story, but it's still not true. But then you move back into fact, and the fact is that Britain is the only country which came into historical existence more or less during the lifetime of Jesus and the composition of the New Testament. The first historical record of it is in 55 BC when Julius Caesar invaded. Julius Caesar invaded Britain twice and wrote about it, but he didn't stay. And so we know a bit about that. The Romans invaded again in the year 43, AD 43, the Emperor Claudius, and conquered the country, turned it into a Roman province, which was the only conquest that the Romans made in New Testament times. I mean, they conquered things before that, they conquered things after that, but actually at the time when, the Apostle Paul was running around preaching the gospel, the only sort of expansion of the Roman Empire was in Britain. And of course, people saw this as providential. A new king has come into the world, a new gospel is being preached to the world, a new country is being opened up. This cannot be accidental, because nothing that happens in history is accidental. There has to be a link somewhere, you see. And so Britain is specially chosen by God to be the Christian country. You see, the country which actually takes shape in the time of Jesus and his disciples. Now, we don't know a whole lot about what was going on there then, because it's prehistoric as far as we're concerned. It's like, we know that there were people living there, Celtic people living there, just as we know that there were Indian tribes in North America before the Europeans arrived. But what you can say about them is kind of limited. Because there isn't a history. There's only what archaeology can reconstruct. And of course, in the 16th century, archaeology didn't exist as a science or anything like that. So it was really myths and legends which had been passed down. But this period, the period from Julius Caesar's invasion to the conquest, the Roman conquest, that roughly 100 years, from the BC to AD, this transition, became in English mythology, later English mythology, a very important period in the history of the country, the supposed history of the country, because it was a time when some very interesting people supposedly ruled it. Now, two of these mythical kings are well known today for totally different reasons. And I'm wondering whether any of you can even name one of them and why they're well known. Two mythical kings of England, or Britain rather, who supposedly lived just before the Roman invasion, in the time of Christ, and who are presented to, one of them is presented to us very much as a kind of Job figure, and so on, but who was regarded as historical in the 16th century, although nowadays we don't think of him as being a real person anymore. And who is he, and how do we know about him? No English majors here? No? Very well-known person. Just didn't exist, that's all. Not King Arthur, that's later. That's another one, but that's later. No, he was Czech, Bohemian, no. But it is a king, definitely. And he's well known, because there's a play written about him, actually called after him. I'm really giving you the hint now. King Lear. Yes, one of Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare wrote King Lear believing that there was such a person. You see? And of course, this is the time of the Reformation, and Lear is presented with his daughters as a sort of model, if not exactly Christian, like Job. That sort of a man of God, living before the coming of Christ sort of thing, but preparing the way. The other person from this mythical period is known to us through a nursery rhyme. Anybody know which one? You'll know the rhyme. It's got king in it. No? It's Old King Cole. Old King Cole was a merry old soul, and a merry old soul was he. And Colchester, which is a town in England, which was the capital of Roman England, was named after him, which is quite a feat because he never existed. Another one that you may have heard of if you've been to London, you won't have heard of him otherwise. There's a street in London called Ludgate, which leads up to St. Paul's Cathedral, and Lud was another one of these mythical kings. But you see, people at the time of the Reformation in England believed these figures existed, and that they were kind of model patriarchs, like Job, preparing the way. So the kingship, you see, in Britain was always held up as a model for the people to follow. This is very important, so that you understand that. Well, okay, then we can skip over the Roman period pretty much and come to the end of the Roman period, when the Romans withdrew from England, from Britain rather, because there was no England, and the Anglo-Saxon tribes invade from Germany at that time to create England, because the English came, they were barbarian tribes from the continent who invaded. And the resistance to these people was led, supposedly, by King Arthur. That's King Arthur. And you have to remember, England is the only country in the world that I know of whose national hero was actually an enemy. I mean, the real King Arthur, if there was a real King Arthur, was trying to keep the English out, not let them in. I mean, it would be kind of like if Sitting Bull was the, archetypal American hero. And people forget that Sitting Bull actually was trying to keep you out, not put you in. So, that kind of thing. You see what I mean? But Arthur, the Arthurian legend, of course, gets completely transformed. Arthur is a model Christian king, and all the Arthurian legends, the Lady of the Lake and Sir Lancelot and all this, deeply, the Holy Grail, what is the Holy Grail? It is the cup that was used at the Last Supper. I mean, all of this is very, very closely tied in with the death and resurrection of Christ. Even the Arthurian myth, you see that Arthur has gone, he's not dead. You see, he merely sleeps in his tomb, and he will rise again from the dead, you see, and reclaim his kingdom. All right? Now, you may think this is rather mythological and rather strange, but Henry VII, who is the father of Henry VIII, who started the English Reformation, Henry VIII was actually the second son of Henry VII, not the eldest son. The eldest son was called Arthur by Henry VII, who was trying to sort of make the prophecy come true. Because he figured that if I call my son Arthur, he will be the resurrected King Arthur. It didn't quite work out that way, but that was what he intended to do. So this prophecy, myth, and all the rest of it was actually taken seriously, you see, by people at the time. And you have to appreciate this reading of the past, you see, is very, and it's particularly important because it had nothing to do with Rome, with the Bishop of Rome, with the Church of Rome, with the Pope, or anything like that. It was all independent of this. And of course, this is used later on as justification for liberating the national church from the control of Rome, because this is seen to be something wrong, something abnormal, something unnatural that wasn't there from the beginning. All right? And it was used in justification of the English Reformation, that the King of England had the right to remove the church from the control of the Pope because the Pope had usurped a power which was not his. And he had usurped it, in effect, from the kings, you see, in the distant past. Well, when did this happen? Of course, it had to happen sometime. And according to the myth, again, this is all myth, but it becomes more historical as it comes into the present. This happened at the Norman Conquest, because William the Conqueror in 1066, when he invaded England with the Pope's blessing. This is true. All right, this is historical fact. What the papacy was trying to do was gain control of the English church. That is also true. Not because the English church had lived independently since the days of King Lear, and so on. That is false. Because the English church, as we know it, was actually the result of a mission sent from Rome by Pope Gregory I, Gregory the Great, in 597. And he sent the monk Augustine, who is not the Augustine of Hippo, not that one, but a different Augustine, to England to evangelize the country. That is historical fact as well. All right? And there was an evangelization which took place at that time. But historically, for many centuries, and this was true all over Western Europe, not just in England, the church tended to be very closely connected with the local kings or lords, the secular powers that ruled locally. And so much so, for example, that in Anglo-Saxon England, before the Norman conquest, legal cases that had to be decided to do with, say, marriage, divorce, probate of wills, all that kind of thing. This was decided in courts in which the secular rulers and the church authorities sat together. There was no separation of church and state. They all just got together and decided together what they were going to do. Well, they could do this because basically Anglo-Saxon England was a big village. There was tribal sort of areas and so on, and everybody was somehow distantly related. It was kind of like rural Alabama, I mean, in a sense, you don't really need the authorities, the law and order, because people can sort of sort it out, in the extended family kind of thing. It was this sort of situation, all right? And this was true in different ways all over Europe, basically a tribal society. In Rome, however, the church authorities didn't like this because they were afraid that Christian principles were being compromised by local interests. You see, the local landowners and so on would obviously do what they thought was the right thing to do, and whether this was what the gospel said or not. And so the church was desperately trying to separate itself from state control, to bring about some kind of separation of church and state, to gain control of its own affairs. All right? And this movement of church reform began around the time of the Norman conquest of England. It was the same sort of time. And the Pope struck a deal with William the Conqueror, and he said, well, I'll support your invasion if you turn around and liberate the church. If you allow the church to run its own, separate the church from the state, give us control of the church, then fine, we'll bless your invasion. And that's basically what happened. That William the Conqueror obviously defeated his enemies, took over the country, reorganized it, and gradually, it didn't happen overnight, but slowly the church was able to claim the right to govern itself, which in the Middle Ages basically meant the right to tax itself, to raise its own revenue, and to live by tithing, and to have tithe recognized. You see that people paid tithe not voluntarily, but as a tax that was recognized by the church, by the state. The state didn't interfere with this because this was what the independence of the church meant, you see, at that particular time. Now, this was seen in the 16th century as a papal takeover of the church. The Norman conquest, which was known at the time as the Norman yoke, Y-O-K-E, and was seen as a negative thing, you see, killing the liberties of the old Anglo-Saxon church. Now, this, of course, is again a myth, but this is how it was perceived, all right, by people in the 16th century. Now, there was, of course, a grain of truth in some of this, because you could argue, and people still argue, that Christianity in Britain came with the Romans. I mean, the first Christians in Britain were probably Roman soldiers sometime in the 2nd century. And there was a church there. And when the Roman Empire fell apart, the church continued to exist in Roman Britain. And it spread to Ireland. St. Patrick, somebody mentioned, was a British Christian, Celtic Christian. He wasn't English, but he was born and brought up in Britain, who went to Ireland and evangelized Ireland. All right? That is more or less, well, it's semi-factual. I mean, it's not entirely factual, but it's more factual than a lot of what we've been talking about so far. Certainly, Ireland was Christianized as the Roman Empire fell apart. It was the first country in Europe outside the old Roman Empire to become Christian, because Ireland had never been conquered by the Romans. What this meant in practice was that evangelism, as it had been done in the Roman Empire, which meant, you see it in the New Testament, Paul going to cities, Ephesus and Corinth and Philippi and so on, and setting up churches in cities. In Ireland, there were no cities, all right? So you couldn't do urban evangelism. So what did they do? Patrick was an innovator in terms of evangelism, because he said, well, the only way you can evangelize, you have to invade the country, in effect. I mean, not with a military force, but with a spiritual force. And the spiritual force were the monks that he organized. The monks were a sort of spiritual army. And he set them up in monasteries, which served like military camps in different parts of the country. And from there, preachers and teachers, evangelists, would radiate out to preach the gospel. And that's how Ireland was evangelized. You see, from monastic centers, all right? And this is the source and the heart of what we now call Celtic Christianity. Now, Celtic Christianity, Celtic spirituality, has also, of course, been mythologized. I mean, today, you can put it in the same category as Narnia and Lord of the Rings and this kind of thing. It's been dealt with like this. But there is a historical kernel to this, because from Ireland, of course, the gospel went to Scotland, what we now call Scotland. It didn't exist then as such, and set up on Iona, the island of Iona, which became a great center. And what is now England was evangelized from the north, as well as from Rome. And in Anglo-Saxon England, there was a competition for a while between the Celtic monks, from Ireland and Scotland, and the Roman mission from Rome, which was finally resolved in favor of Rome, mainly because the argument was that Rome represented the universal church. All the countries of the world, were supposedly at least subordinate to Rome, whereas the Celtic church was a local thing, and therefore, of course, had less authority. That's the theory. But submission to Rome, when it came in 664 in England, had the great advantage in that Rome was far away. I mean, Rome was kind of like your mother-in-law. I mean, great at a distance. And, you could always sort of, write for Christmas and that kind of thing. But you didn't actually have to live with her. It's a long way. Whereas, of course, the Celtic Church was on the doorstep, and therefore much more likely to control what you were doing. And so, therefore, you didn't really want to let it do too much. However, the Celtic Church manned, the rank and file of the church. I mean, where are your missionaries, evangelists, priests, etc. going to come from? Well, they came from there, basically. And the old Anglo-Saxon church, the English church, was deeply influenced by the Celtic church. If you want to read about this and see how deep this influence actually was, all you have to do is read Bede, the great historian of England, the ecclesiastical history of the English people. And while Bede pays great attention to Rome and says the Pope, sent the missionaries and all that kind of thing, gives them, good billing, most of the time he concentrates on the Irish mission and missionaries, and he had great respect for them because they were very learned and, they had high educational standards and so on. And he himself had learned his Latin and everything else from the Irish missionaries. So there was a much closer connection there than people realize. And the Irish zeal for evangelism through the monastic-based communities was what Bede did and what he practiced and what he encouraged the Anglo-Saxons to do. You see this today. The legacy of this survives today in place names, because the word monastery, monasterium in Latin, got anglicized as minster. A minster is a monastery. But it was a peculiar kind of monastery because it was basically an evangelistic center. Not just a monastery in the usual sense of the word, but a kind of base camp for evangelism. And all over England to this day, places and churches and so on have got minster in them. Westminster, of course, in London being the most well-known example. But there are plenty of others. I mean, York Minster, the cathedral in York is called a minster. There's Wimborne Minster. There's all sorts of places called minster, all right? And this was exported to the European continent by evangelists, Irish and English evangelists who went to Germany, who went to Holland, who went to Scandinavia, and so on. And so with the result that you have places in Germany called Munster, which were taken there from England. That's that Munster is the same thing. So this is the legacy of this evangelistic work. And the great thing you see about a monastic-based spirituality or monastic-based evangelism is the high degree of personal commitment involved. Because to be a monk basically means to give up normal life. You're celibate, you're poor, you're basically joining an army. It's the Salvation Army, in a different kind of way. And it's interesting because you see today, I mean, if you go out into the pagan world around you, you don't have to go very far. The other side of campus will be far enough. It's interesting. People who have no time for the church. Have you ever noticed this? They really have no time for the church. I think the church are a bunch of hypocrites. The one Christian group that they're prepared to say something good about is the Salvation Army. They'll give money to the Salvation Army. They'll give clothes because they see the Salvation Army as doing some good. You see what I mean? It has a good reputation. I mean, they're oddballs. I mean, they are in a way. I mean, who's going to go and dressing up like that and playing the trombone, on the street corners? They are a bit strange, but they're respected. You see what I mean? In a way that, say, Baptists and Presbyterians are not particularly respected. And it's an interesting phenomenon, this. But think of it like that, and you realize, you see, that the monks, the fact that they sacrificed and they did this kind of thing, I mean, okay, they were weirdos in a way, but they were weirdos who did things like chase the snakes out of Ireland and so on, I mean, like, okay, it might be a bit scary having someone like that in your house, but you have to admit that, this is not an everyday occurrence. You see what I mean? So there was this kind of, well, it's not for me, but I have to admire it. It's kind of like, figure skaters or acrobats. You look at them and you think, wow, isn't that great? But you're not actually going to do it yourself, but you admire those who do. And this is the way they looked at it. You see, these people. And they were the models. These were the people who did. And they came, of course, from the people. They were ordinary people who'd given their lives to do this kind of thing. Now, this was different from the kind of Christianity that you found in the Roman world, in the Mediterranean world, because there Christianity was urban. It had spread from the cities into the countryside, all right, eventually. But it was urban, it was much more sophisticated. All you have to do is look at the New Testament, you know. I mean, who were the Christians in the New Testament? Well, they were business people, really. I mean, Priscilla and Aquila and that, you know, the tent makers and so on. I mean, these were your traders and business people running around. I mean, perfectly decent, acceptable, nice people and all that. But somehow they lack the heroic quality, you know, of a monk who goes out and performs miracles. You know what I mean? It's a different kind of thing. And so in the Mediterranean world, there wasn't this same sense of, you know, personal devotion and commitment to Christ in that way that there was in Northern Europe generally, and particularly in Britain. And this is one of the factors which is involved at the time of the Reformation, because it's the lands which were evangelized by monks which became Protestant. It's very interesting, this, you see, because this underlying Protestantism is monasticism for the masses. That's basically what it is. It's taking monastic discipline, self-discipline, out of the monastery into the world. And a lot of things that we take for granted, like singing hymns together, like reading the Bible, like praying regularly every day, these were monastic practices, you see, in the Middle Ages. That's what they did in the monasteries. And they were adapted for family use, for everyday use. You know, a personal, daily, devotional life. And this is vitally important to understand, that the Reformation brought religion into the home. You know, the practice of daily prayer, family prayers, family Bible reading, all this kind of thing. I mean, in fact, the family, as we understand it today, you know, mother, father, and children, the family unit, to some degree, was a creation of the Reformation. I mean, not totally, but, you know, it certainly was bolstered very much by Reformation spirituality. So this is a very important aspect. And, of course, the original reformers, the English reformers, knew this. They knew there was this tradition in the background, and they drew on it. They claimed it for themselves, rightly or wrongly. Now, as I say, you can read the history today, and you can say to yourself, oh, well, they didn't understand that. That was wrong. It didn't work like that. That may be true, but it's what they understood, all right? And they came to see that anything that came from Rome, or visibly, obviously from Rome, was somehow imposed and alien. That there was a native Christianity which went right back to the New Testament, which had a deep sort of spirituality of its own, which had evangelized half of Europe. You know, there was a tremendous tradition there, essentially independent. And they relied on this, you see. This became a big deal at the time of the Reformation, you see, as a justification for this. Now, that's the myth, and the way the history was understood. When we come into the world of fact, we find a situation where England, at the time of the Reformation, was the most advanced country in Europe politically. Advanced, of course, is a very loaded word to use, and it depends what you mean. But it was the only country in Europe at that time which was recognizably modern. I mean, it could be compared, it's similar to what you find today. It's recognizably the same. By this, I mean its national frontiers have really not changed very much. Looks pretty much the same on the map. Of course, it helps when you're an island, to have frontiers that don't change very much, but this is a minor detail. Well, not a minor detail. Shakespeare, of course, I mean, you read Shakespeare, it's classic in Henry V, about the sceptred isle and so on. I mean, he regarded the fact that Britain was an island as God's blessing, keep those awful French out of here, and so on. And this is still, of course, a theme today. I mean, those of you who read you may have read just before Christmas when David Cameron, Prime Minister, went to Brussels and stood up and told the French and Germans where to get off. They wanted to save the euro, and Cameron wasn't interested in that. He was just interested in standing up to the French and the Germans. And of course, he did a very silly thing, but he got home and was regarded as a national hero. Why? Because he told the French and Germans where to get off, and that's the most important thing. Being right and wrong is another matter. Don't care about that. As long as you kick the French in the teeth, that's fine. This has always been the way. So you laugh, but the United States is the same. It's true. I mean, in this country, nobody, where the president goes somewhere, people don't ask whether he's doing the right thing. It's just whether he's really kicking the enemy in the teeth. And the enemy's anybody, really. So this sort of thing. And it's this way, but more important, the king was in control of the state. There was a state. What does this mean? It means that he had the power of taxation. You see, taxation in England goes back over 1,000 years. There's a continuous record of national taxation. You see, that in other words, the king could decree that people were going to pay a tax, and they paid it. And this was not true in any other European country, where the various kings could decree whatever they liked, but whether it was going to happen or not really depended on, whether he would go with force to make it happen. And this was a weakness in other European countries, you see. I mean, take France, for example. One of the reasons why France collapsed and the French Revolution came along was because the old regime, the monarchical regime, was never able to impose a uniform system of government. I mean, the kings of France could sign decrees and so on, but whether it actually happened or not, nobody really knew, And this was true, of course, of Spain. It was true of Germany, which was subdivided into all kinds of little principalities and so on, and you name it, you see. But in England, there was control. And the difference this made could be enormous. You see, France was a country of 27 million people in the Middle Ages. No, maybe that was a bit later. Say France was a country of about 22 million people, 22 million people in 1500. England had about 4 million, 5 million. But England was able to wage the 100 Years' War in France and nearly conquered France, not because of superior numbers, but because of superior organization. Because when the English king summoned people to war, they went. The French king summoned people to war, and they went, up yours, and I wasn't doing that. And of course, it's typical that the King of England was actually a vassal of the King of France, because William the Conqueror, of course, had been Duke of Normandy, and therefore a subject to the King of France. And imagine if the governor of Florida, for example, had gone off and conquered Cuba and made himself president of Cuba, and sort of lived in Havana and acted as governor of Florida on the side, and the president of the U.S. would call him from time to time and say, well, you're actually governor of Florida, you owe allegiance to me. and he'd sort of say, yeah, well, that's your opinion, but I'm actually running an independent country on the side, tough. And this is basically what happened, you see. I mean, France and Germany and so on, they were subdivided. Luther got away with the Reformation because he was supported by the local princes. Why were the local princes supporting Luther? Because they were against the emperor, and they saw Luther as a way of getting more independence, you see, from the central government. And Germany was sufficiently decentralized for this to be possible. And so, of course, in the German Reformation, the German Reformation is basically the splitting up of Germany into little principalities and so on until the 19th century, because the 19th century, the unification of Germany in the 19th century was basically the unification of Protestant Germany, Prussia, Bismarck, and so on, against Catholic Germany, which was Austria-Hungary, and the Habsburgs, and so all that. It was the Protestant-Catholic rivalry, which finally played itself out in German unification in the 19th century. So it goes like this. England's completely different from this. This kind of reformation in England was impossible. You couldn't have some local person somewhere in one of the counties declaring a reformation, that had nothing to do with the king. Why? Because the king ruled the country, genuinely ruled the country. So therefore, the only way you could ever have a reformation in England would be if the king supported. Either the king would support it, or the king would be overthrown. One or the other. And of course, in the history of the English Reformation, you find that actually both happened. I mean, Henry VIII supported it, and Charles I was beheaded because he didn't support it, or didn't support it enough, and so on. So the two things are interconnected. You cannot have one without the other. Now, when in 1534, which was the year that the English Church broke with Rome, the links with Rome were cut, how many Protestant or Reformed Christians were there in England at this time? A rough guess would be 0. There weren't any. The only one that you can think of who might qualify was William Tyndale, but William Tyndale had fled the country. He was actually in Germany at the time. So he doesn't really count. And beyond that, it's hard to think of anybody. Now, I'm not saying there weren't people there, but let's put it like this. If you were a supporter of Luther and Lutheranism in England in 1534, would be rather like an Auburn fan in Tuscaloosa. I'm not saying there aren't any, but you've got to watch what you do. Not because the state will come after you, but life could be made difficult for you. You see what I mean? You laugh at this, but a few years ago we had a student here who was from Texas. He was Texas A&M. I'm very proud of it. Don't ask me why. But anyway, he had on the back of his truck, one of these things that said Texas A&M and so on. And it was just at the time that Franchione, the Alabama coach, was robbed, stolen by Texas A&M. Do you remember that? About 10 years ago. And Tuscaloosa was in an uproar. And David, the day student, was driving home. He was from Dallas, and he was going home for Christmas, I think, or Thanksgiving or something like that. And I said, David, I wouldn't stop in Tuscaloosa if I were you with Texas A&M on the back of your truck. Not a good idea. But David, being from Texas, you can't tell them anything. So, the stupid man, he's a very good friend of mine, but he's really dumb, He stopped in Tuscaloosa, and he came out, and his tires were slashed. And I said, well, I told you. I mean, even I know you don't do that. You know, I mean, like, how dumb can you be? And it was the week. It was the same week, you know, that Franchione had been taken. Yeah, I mean, really. So anyhow, this is the kind of thing, you see, that anybody who had Protestant sympathies in England at the time that the church broke with Rome had to keep it quiet. You know, better for them not to say anything. All right? Contrast this with Germany, where, of course, the Reformation had become a popular movement across half the country. Or France, where, again, there were a lot of people who were sympathetic to the Reformation. I mean, Calvin was converted in the same year that England broke with Rome. But Calvin was converted not because the king said anything, and the king was against it. He was converted because he met people who were reading Luther, and, you know, he was joined in with those circles in Paris who were having Bible studies, that kind of thing. It was a semi-popular movement. But it's very instructive, you see, that Protestantism never gained control of France because it could never gain control of the government. And because France wasn't as united as England, I mean, it was more dispersed and so on, Protestants could exist in various remote places and get along reasonably well. But the more the country was centralized and brought under central control, the more Protestants were suppressed because they were a potentially disloyal element. All right? So in the end, of course, Protestantism was more or less snuffed out as the government centralized itself. In England, the centralization had already occurred. All right? And so the Reformation couldn't get started unless it was approved by the authorities. This is the importance of this. You see, it would never have happened if the authorities hadn't been won over. And Henry VIII, you see, by a fluke, really, because Henry VIII was not the slightest bit interested in Reformation. I mean, Henry VIII was interested in only one thing, and if breaking with the Pope was the way to get it, well, that was fine by him. But, you know, he had ulterior motives, shall we say. Okay? So, I mean, from the beginning, of course, Protestantism in England was a test of loyalty to the state. That's an important ingredient of it, right? And it was only later, of course, that, you know, as it gradually sort of sank in and people began to understand what it was all about, that gradually the state became subordinate to the church. I mean, you know, the balance shifted when the Puritans came along and so on. But Puritanism in England only came into existence because the state had not gone far enough. The state wasn't really interested in Reformation in a theological sense. It was only interested in control, right? Which is a whole other thing. Okay, you follow what I'm saying? This is a very important issue. Now, it's not a question of belief, unbelief, or anything like that. Most people at the time were believers in so far as they understood what belief was all about. But it was the question of the degree of understanding. How much did they really know? What were they expected to believe? You see, how much of the gospel had communicated itself to the ordinary person. And this is extremely hard to know. Except that the average person believed that if you took your faith seriously, your life would have to change. This is the monastic inheritance. You see, people who were serious about belief are people who are going to get up and they're going to change their lives. They're going to leave ordinary life behind and become something different. So curiously, the notion of being born again and and so on, was easier for people to absorb and to understand than a whole lot of other things, because this was kind of expected, all right? That if it was going to really make a difference to you, this difference would be seen, it would be visible. And so that aspect, was strongly present in people's minds. It was just a question of how free would people be to do it? You see, how would it actually play out in practice? Right, well, I've gone over my time, as I always do.